Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to Global Agenda at the University of Delaware. It's great to see all of you here this evening. I'm Ralph Begleiter. Welcome also to our guests participating on the internet via Second Life. In the spring of 1991, I flew into Kuwait just weeks after the end of the first Gulf War. It was one of the most dramatic flights I've ever taken. And trust me, as a former CNN reporter, I've taken a few flights. Below us, we could see thick black plumes of smoke billowing up from the desert and nearly obliterating the sun. On both sides of the plane, through the gray air, we could see the flames of raging oil fires set by the retreating army of Saddam Hussein in spite for having been driven out of Kuwait by the U.S. and its allies. Maliciously uncapped oil wells were burning, precious fuel literally going up in smoke, and pools of oily sand all around us. We later drove to the scene, which was even more dramatic on the ground. At that time, 17 years ago, the price of crude oil was about $27 a barrel, adjusted for inflation. Today, the price of a barrel has reached about $120, 4 times as much. And most of that increase has occurred in just the last 5 years since the U.S. invaded Iraq. How many of you drive a car? Okay, how many of you have bought gas in the last 2 weeks? Okay, good. Don't have to explain too much. The AAA reports the average price of gas right here in northern Delaware has risen in just the past year from about $2.95 a gallon to $3.62 a gallon. How many of you have cut back a bit on your driving or bought a more fuel-efficient car in the past year? Cut back on driving or bought a more fuel-efficient car. Okay, quite a number of you have. And that's the connection between the price of oil and the politics of climate change. If higher prices drive you to drive less, you've made a contribution to reducing carbon emissions into the atmosphere, even though that wasn't your motive for doing so. Transportation is one of the biggest contributors of greenhouse gases to our environment, which is why I invited our speaker tonight to take part in the Global Agenda program on the politics of climate change. You might have thought, kind of an improbable guest speaker on climate change, the president of an oil company. Our guest is John Hofmeister, president of the Shell Oil Company. He assumed the leadership of all Shell operations in the U.S. 3 years ago. And I'm told it's already driven him to retirement. That's a joke. Mr. Hofmeister previously worked for Shell in the firm's Dutch headquarters in the Netherlands, and he's held a number of top executive posts with telecommunication and other energy firms. He earned his bachelor's and master's degrees in political science from Kansas State University. He's a member of the U.S. Department of Energy's Hydrogen and Fuel Cell Technical Advisory Committee and a top leader in the American Petroleum Institute. Please welcome Mr. John Hofmeister to the University of Delaware.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Just to get a little bit rooted, if I may, I spent much of my growing up years in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and the University of Delaware was always seen as one of those high-profile, highfalutin universities that us country boys from Lancaster County could only aspire to. So this is my first visit to the University of Delaware. Thank you very much for allowing me to be here. I'd like to talk about a number of very difficult issues this evening, and to present them to you in a way in which we try to approach this very difficult subject in nonpartisan fashion, because at some point in my remarks, I will speak to the paralysis of partisanship in dealing with energy issues in this country. The paralysis of partisanship is a political outcome in which not enough or nothing happens. And I would subscribe to you that we, as citizens of this country, are, in a sense, the victims of the paralysis of partnership in our modern history. More about that later. But let me start, if I may, with 3 hard truths about which we can essentially only accept them as reality. We may disagree with them, we may not like them, we may not want them, but as hard truths, they are the reality we must live with, cope with, and deal with, which is why the paralysis of partisanship is unacceptable. The first hard truth is that global demand for energy is accelerating. That's a very simple statement. Global demand for energy is accelerating. 5% of the world's population, ladies and gentlemen, uses 25% of the world's energy. Guess which 5% that is? It's the citizens of the United States of America. 5% of the world's population using 25% of the world's energy. Well, look around us. Other nations see a lifestyle with freedom of choice. Other nations see a lifestyle of comfort, ease, and convenience. And they say, why not us, to their political leadership? And so, as they industrialize, as they modernize, as they grow their economies, there is no alternative but to use more energy in so doing. And so whether it's the demand for coal, whether it's the demand for gas and oil, whether it's the demand for all forms of alternative energies, the demand for energy is accelerating and is likely to continue. Example, in China today, there are 3 cars for every 100 people. Do you think that is likely to continue, given the experience in this country? Well, we know the answer is no. The second hard truth is that so-called easy oil. Remember the Beverly Hillbillies, where Uncle Jeb shot a bullet into the ground and out came bubbling crude. We had a notion in this country that easy, convenient oil was an endless commodity. Well, let's face the facts. Easy, convenient oil is peaking. We cannot keep up production to meet demand because the oil fields of our history, the oil fields of Kansas, of Oklahoma, of Arkansas, of Texas, the easy, convenient oil is depleting. And while there remain opportunities through new technology called enhanced oil recovery to go back into those declining reservoirs or those decommissioned fields and to get more, the peak of an oil field's production is at its beginning, not at its end. And so whatever we would do, the easy, convenient oil is not increasing in supply. And the third hard truth, using more energy as we know energy today means that we will be putting more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere at a time in which the nation and the world must come to grips with carbon constraint. For Shell, the debate on climate change is over and has been over since 1997. In 1997, Shell made a commitment, public commitment, to its shareholders and to the public at large that we would begin a process of reducing our carbon footprint as a company to below 1990 levels by 2010. We are on that trajectory, we are on target, and we will achieve that objective by 2010. We're one company. We will continue, however, to be in a highly intensive carbon-producing business because that is the business we know. We also, in 1997, committed ourselves to a renewable fuels portfolio, including wind, including solar, including hydrogen, including, at the time, forestry. 10 years later, we've learned a lot. We are continuing to invest hundreds of millions of dollars a year in technologies that are not oil or gas related. They are biofuels, they are wind, they are solar, they are hydrogen fuel cell related. But they are small amounts of money relative to what it takes to continue to try to meet the supply requirements or the demand of the world. And we are largely a hydrocarbon company, and we're not going to pretend we're not. One of our competitors claims to be beyond petroleum, but actually their main business is petroleum, if you get past their advertising commercial. So those three hard truths are the way I start, ladies and gentlemen. Point one, the demand for energy continues to increase. Point two, easy conventional oil is peaking or has peaked and is more difficult to keep up with the supplies. And third, we must deal with carbon constraints going forward. I'll talk more about carbon constraints later. Let me now shift to this paralysis of partisanship for a moment. There's no question the United States of America is a great country with a great history, an even greater future, and with the right political leadership, we can achieve whatever we seek to achieve as a people and as a nation. In fact, let me point to Homeland Security as one of the great accomplishments of this nation. For more than 200 years, this nation has focused on Homeland Security. And as we look at international issues, global issues, local issues, this nation is a nation that is secure. It has not always been perfect. 9/11 was a wake-up call. But for the history of this nation, Homeland Security has been a success. We don't live in fear every night because on a bipartisan basis, ladies and gentlemen, our political leadership concentrates on Homeland Security and gets the job done. On economic security, Americans, as a rule, do not like economic insecurity. And we have institutions in place that work night and day to ensure that our economic security is always being looked after. There are disruptions, there are recessions, there are incidences, there are fears that are out there, but we have the people, the leadership, the institutions that have been created on a bipartisan basis to manage economic security on a sustained basis, whether that's the Federal Reserve Board, whether that's the Securities and Exchange Commission, whether that's the Department of Treasury. We have the instruments at hand to deal with economic security. And when we have a crisis, such as the dot-com meltdown of the late 90s, such as the adjustable rate mortgage fiasco that we're experiencing today, on a bipartisan basis, our national leadership comes together to find solutions. How about energy security? How are we doing as a nation on energy security? Are we operating in bipartisan fashion on energy security when the President of the United States says on Wednesday of last week, we need to open ANWR so we get more domestic supply into the system, and within 8 hours that story is a dead-on-arrival story, whether in the halls of Congress or on the media, and it's described as yesterday's solution, which didn't work then and won't work tomorrow. And the Democratic Party leadership says, no way, Jose, to a proposal from a president, you know that's called paralysis of partisanship. Or when the Democratic Party says, let's tax the oil companies for their excessive profits so that we can put more money into the alternative research and development, and the Republican Party says no, or the Republican president says we will veto such a bill, that's the paralysis of partisanship. Nothing happens. And at $120 a barrel, ladies and gentlemen, after 3 energy policy acts of 2005, 2006, and 2007, not a single additional barrel of domestic oil is being produced in this country at $120 a barrel when the cost would be $20 or less. To produce domestic oil in this country, we can do it in conventional oil fashion, on land or offshore, at much lower costs than the current price of importing more oil into this country from other sources. Why aren't we doing it? The paralysis of partisanship. Let me offer you a few outrageous statements. I haven't gotten outrageous yet. Let me please offer you a few outrageous statements, just to put in perspective what it is we're up against and what we have to do as a nation. First outrageous statement. This country has not had an energy security strategy since World War II. By energy security strategy, I mean a holistic, comprehensive, short-term, medium-term, long-term set of policy solutions to assure our citizens their energy security since World War II. What was our energy security and strategy in World War II? It was very simple. Produce everything we can of everything we could and ration it to consumers to support the war effort. That was a comprehensive, holistic strategy, and it's the last time this nation had an energy strategy. Outrageous statement number 2. We as Americans, in a system of democratic capitalism, like to believe we operate in a market, that there is an energy market, an oil and gas market, a market of different products, a market of Shell versus Exxon versus Chevron. Ladies and gentlemen, let me suggest to you, the idea that the oil market is a free market is a nonsense. When the most of the world's daily production comes from a cartel of sovereign national states that control the output and therefore the price, it is hard to say that that is a free market. When the paralysis of partisanship has culminated in a 30-year moratorium on the exploration and production of U.S. domestic oil and gas resources, prohibiting by regulation and by law the development of U.S. natural resources in 85% of the outer continental shelf of the lower 48 states, to say that we operate in a free market of oil production is a nonsense. I don't know if you knew that. For 30 years, our Congress, Democratic and Republican, over the years, has forbidden American oil companies from exploring for and producing oil or gas in 85% of the outer continental shelf and hundreds of millions of acres of federal lands. It's off limits, leaving our nation's energy supply coming from then existing oil fields in the lower 48, the Alaska Prudhoe Bay, and 15% of the outer continental shelf largely located in the western Gulf of Mexico. That is the limit of the oil market in which we can access supply, even though we know there's more than 100 billion barrels of oil and gas resource in the off-limits properties of the outer continental shelf and federal land. That, to me, is an outrage, and therefore an outrageous statement to say we are prohibited from developing our own oil resources while the demand of the nation is for more oil and gas paid for by consumers at $120 a barrel, today's price. We are not running out of oil. How's that for an outrageous statement? The nation and the world are not running out of oil. There is more where it comes from. When you hear the peak oil theorists talk about peak oil, they are referring to the easy conventional oil that I mentioned earlier is unable to keep up with the demand. But when it comes to oil resources in the ground, we are not running out. The 100 billion barrels I just mentioned are complemented by what's unknown on the outer continental shelf, for example, off the coasts of Alaska, or the unconventional oil and gas resources, such as the oil shale of Colorado, or the oil sands of Alberta, where there are 1 trillion barrels in Canada, 1 trillion barrels in Colorado, Wyoming, and Utah, not to count the 1 trillion barrels in Venezuela of what's called Orinoco heavy oil, which is almost solid, which needs a different production method to get it out of the ground. So we are not running out of oil, contrary to what many people might have you believe. Here's a few more outrageous statements, and then we'll move on. In the United States of America today, we use 21 million barrels a day of oil. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't have any idea what 21 million barrels looks like. It's never been in one place. It's hard to imagine. Let's break it down. 21 million barrels of oil, ladies and gentlemen, equals the consumption of 10,000 gallons of oil per second. So every second of every minute of every hour of every day of the week of every month, we Americans are consuming 10,000 gallons a second. That's a backyard swimming pool full of oil gone every second. In addition, we use a lot of coal. Every 3 seconds, this nation burns a railroad car full of coal. That's 20 cars a minute. So in an hour, we as a nation burn 1,200 railroad cars of coal. In the case of 10,000 gallons of oil, or 1,200 a second, or 1,200 coal cars an hour, all of that material is consumed, except for the CO2 that goes into the atmosphere. So we, as a hydrocarbon-based energy economy, by today's definition, are putting enormous quantities of CO2 into the atmosphere. But what about natural gas? We use 60 billion cubic feet of natural gas a day. How much is that? Well, if you took a cubic foot of natural gas and stacked it on top of each other 60 billion times, you could build a bridge from here to the moon 25 times over. That's how much natural gas we consume every day. So when we think of alternatives, we think of solar and biofuels and wind and other alternative forms of energy. Let's begin to imagine the scale of displacement that would be necessary to make a material difference in the consumption of today's 10,000 gallons a second, 1,200 coal cars an hour, and 60 billion cubic feet a day of natural gas. What are we going to do about this when, in addition to consuming all of this, we have been using historically inefficient means to consume all of that energy? Let me give you an example. If you filled up your car at the local Shell station and bought 20 gallons of gas, that 20 gallons would cost you about $72. Of that $72 that you gave to the station on your credit card or in cash, only 20%, or roughly $15, of what you just paid for gives you mobility. By definition, the internal combustion engine is 20% efficient. 20% of that gasoline gives you mobility. If you bought Exxon or Chevron or BP, you wouldn't get any more mobility because of the design of the internal combustion engine. So it's not the gas that's the issue, it's the efficiency of the engine. So 80% of the money that you put into that gas station was burned up as heat that went into the atmosphere. That's the nature of the cars we drive. It's even worse if you're on an airplane. A jet engine is 8% efficient. 8% of the aviation fuel gives that airplane push. 92% of the aviation fuel leaves the engine as heat in the atmosphere, doing nothing for push. If you have incandescent light bulbs in your home, and Congress did act to eliminate incandescent light bulbs over a period of time in the Energy Act of 2007, 3% of the electricity consumed by that electric light bulb gives you light. 97% is wasted as heat, but of course your air conditioner will make up for that loss, for that extra heat in your home. So ladies and gentlemen, the point is, and I'll finish now with, this is the last of my outrageous statements, I hope. The issue is, not only are we consuming massive quantities of hydrocarbons, we are using those hydrocarbons in a horribly inefficient manner because that is the limit of our current technology. So what do we do about all this? What do we do about this never-ending increase in the crude oil price? What do we do about this CO2 that's saturating our atmosphere by man-made methods, in addition to natural methods? You read about the volcanoes that are exploding. around the world. That's more CO2 in the atmosphere. There's nothing we can do to stop the annual degradation of biomass as it emits carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Fortunately, we also have spring comes around, and that spring season eats up a lot of that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere with the oxidation of plants and so forth. But let's be clear, what do we do about all this? How do we get out of this partisan paralysis to have an energy strategy for the future that enables us to move forward as a society, that enables us to maintain our economic competitiveness and our beloved lifestyles? Because as a professional who has moved across this country and in the last 2 years visited 50 major cities in this country to talk about this issue, I am convinced that Americans are not interested in dramatic changes to lifestyle. We like mobility, we like creature comfort, we like television at night, we like HD TVs, which use considerably more electricity than analog TVs, we like hot showers, we like to travel on vacations, we like our lifestyle. That's unlikely to change. What do we do about it? Well, Shell has a 12-point plan. I'll cover it all quickly so we can get into questions and answers. First of all, whether you like it or not, we must have more access to more hydrocarbon, oil and gas resources. That 30-year moratorium has got to come to an end because natural decline in existing oil fields we cannot replace without more access, and if we only are allowed access to international resources, guess what's going to happen to the price of oil? It's going to continue to climb, because it's not just the United States of America which wants more oil and gas. It's China, it's India, it's Europe, it's the whole world wants more oil and gas. And we sit here in the paralysis of partisanship, unwilling or unable to access more of our own domestic natural resources. Now, is that silly or foolish or what? But we must have more conventional oil and gas access if we are to meet the demand of today, tomorrow, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, every day of the week, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm being parochial here, 14,000 Shell stations need more gas. Because 6 million people a day in America come to a Shell station to fill up their car. And what do I say to the dealers across America who own their own stations and buy their gas from Shell? What do I say to them if we can't fill their tanks? I say to them, you're out of business. And it's not our mission in life to put local business people out of business. Our job is to fill their tanks. We must have more access to more domestic resources if we're going to do that. Second, we need to develop the unconventional oil and gas resources that are available to us, because we will not otherwise keep up with the demand for oil and gas. We may have strong advocates of alternative energies in this room, and probably not one of you is a stronger advocate than I am personally or my company is. But in the short term, which is 10 to 15 to 20 years, we can't change quickly enough to somehow disassociate ourselves from an oil and gas infrastructure and replace it simply with biofuels or wind or solar or other alternatives. It can't happen in that time frame. So we must access the unconventional oil and gas, the oil shale of Colorado, the oil sands of Canada, in order to augment the supply of conventional oil and gas. It is more expensive, it is CO2 intensive, but there is no alternative but to increasing the supply of oil and gas to meet the daily needs of economic development and growth and competitiveness and the lifestyles we've chosen. Thirdly, we can't stop using coal. Thousands of power plants across this nation need coal, and it is the cheapest form of electricity generation. But let's consider new technology when it comes to coal. Coal gasification, rather than the burning of pulverized coal, is an alternative we should be pursuing. Shell is very actively involved in the gasification technology, which turns coal into synthetic gas. How do we do that? Instead of burning pulverized coal, we all know how coal burns. We've all experienced it, seen it, sometimes smelled it. Well, let's move to a different technology where instead of pulverizing the coal into pea gravel size and burning it, let's pulverize it to the consistency of talcum powder. let's take that coal and mash it down until it is the consistency of talcum powder. Push that talcum powder into a big gasifier at 1,000 pounds per square, actually 1,200 pounds per square inch of pressure at 2,400 degrees Fahrenheit. Put a little oxygen in the gasifier, and what happens to those molecules of coal is they break down into their component parts. With the addition of oxygen, that gasified coal becomes syngas. That syngas can then burn as cleanly as natural gas, because that's essentially what it has become, in a clean gas turbine. It's called integrated gas combined cycle production of electricity. What about the CO2? It's still back in the gasifier. By containing that CO2, we can now take it out separately from the syngas. We can turn that CO2 into a supercritical liquid and then convey that supercritical liquid through a system of pipes and put it into safe geologies underground and sequester that CO2 for infinity. That technology, ladies and gentlemen, gives us clean energy from coal. Gasification, carbon capture, and sequestration is a means by which we can have both coal and electricity and an inexpensive source of electricity in the years to come. Point 4, we must augment the existing supply of natural gas in this country with liquefied natural gas. Now, the East Coast is having a serious problem, and the West Coast is having a serious problem on the infrastructure necessary to have liquefied natural gas, where gas that is produced in stranded gas fields, meaning there's no market, in the outer continental shelf of Africa or Australia, where there's no market for that gas, we can cool that gas into a liquid form. We can ship that liquid gas super cold by tanker to this country. We can then put that super cold liquid through pipes into a storage tank, which we do today in Cove Point, Maryland, or in Elba Island, Georgia. And that cold gas can be regasified, and it can augment our supply of natural gas, the cleanest form of hydrocarbon. But the East Coast and the West Coast are having a problem. That is, nobody wants the infrastructure. Everybody wants the benefits of clean natural gas, but everybody who can wants to block the building of regasification terminals. If this nation doesn't come to grips with industrial infrastructure in the post-industrial era, we're going to have a serious problem supplying all those HDTVs and all those computers and all those PCs in the way in which we live our life in the future. Because guess what? Without electrons that come from electricity, we're not going to power up our PCs to live in a post-industrial world. We're not going to be able to support our government, our schools, our homes, if we don't have more electrons, because a post-industrial society, ladies and gentlemen, uses as much, if not more, electricity than an industrial society because of what we have chosen in terms of our way forward. So liquefied natural gas represents another source of energy as part of a holistic formula. But let's move beyond hydrocarbons. Let's go to biofuel. It is time to put more emphasis in this country on biofuels, but let's focus on biofuels beyond corn. We've seen in 2 or 3 short years a dramatic change in the attitude and in the understanding of biofuel from corn. Now, those of us who warned the White House, those of us who warned the Congress about the consequences of overbuilding the ethanol commitment on a corn basis alone are somehow feeling a little bit vindicated, because in reality what's happened with corn-based ethanol is farmers have chosen corn rather than growing wheat or soy, so that chicken feed and other food sources are suffering a price spiral, just like oil is, because there isn't enough supply of food commodities because of the commitment to corn in order to make fuel. So Shell's position is, and I believe this to be true, there is lots of opportunity for biofuel to augment our gasoline supply for liquid petroleum purposes, but let's focus on non-food-based sources of biofuel. Shell's made commitments in 5 areas thus far. We're making commitments in the use of algae, the use of straw, the use of wood chips and sawdust, the use of supercritical enzymes for breaking down cellulosic materials in all kinds of plants and municipal waste. There are lots of opportunities to produce liquid fuel from cellulosic ethanol, but it doesn't have to be food-based, and that's where we've concentrated our investments. Next, let's move on to wind. Wind is a great natural resource, and we waste it every day. It just blows past us. By having wind farms, wind turbines set up on areas that produce the wind, we can produce an awful lot of CO2-free electricity. But here we have a challenge. The challenge is, what do we do to get the electricity from the wind farm to where it's needed, to the marketplace? We need transmission lines. And transmission lines are a challenge, because where they don't exist, people don't want them. But where the wind exists, and the wind turbines will exist, there's only one way to get the electricity to market, and that's transmission lines where today they don't exist, because it's a new source of electricity. There's a debate on offshore wind farms, onshore wind farms. Both are applicable, both are useful. Offshore are more expensive than onshore, but they both need transmission lines. But Shell is now at a gigawatt a day, nearly a gigawatt a day, of electricity from wind farms, 7 farms in 5 states, and we continue to invest in new farms in West Virginia and Texas, and we will continue to do more. We have a lot of opportunity, ladies and gentlemen, to produce electricity from solar sources. Now, Shell was in the silicon solar business, but we gave up on silicon because we believe silicon is, as a substrate, too expensive, too energy inefficient, and does not have the future commercial promise that nanotechnology represents. And so our investment dollars are now going towards thin film technology, which I believe you at the University of Delaware are also focusing on. And by working together between corporations and universities, I believe that the nanotechnology research is ongoing and that the future of solar energy is very promising indeed, and of course that is CO2-free. Let's also talk about hydrogen. There are those who say the hydrogen economy and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles always have great promise and always will. I'm more of a believer than that. I'm not a skeptic. I know it's taken a long time for hydrogen to develop, but having driven a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle last fall on the Ford Motor Test Track in Dearborn, I can tell you, once Americans get behind the wheel of a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle, they will not want to go back to an internal combustion fueled vehicle. The reason is the energy efficiency, the get up and go, the fun of driving it, the sport of the driving process in a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle is so much different than an internal combustion engine where you've got 8 cylinders pumping, a crankcase turning around, a transmission rolling around, a drive shaft, and a set of rear wheels going through a rear end. You're losing all of that energy in its conversion from part to part. In a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle, like an electric vehicle, you're often running with an electric motor on each wheel. There are great advantages to it, but here's the issue with hydrogen. Where do you buy it? Do you buy it at your local Shell station, or do you go to an industrial site behind the railroad tracks behind a fence to get your hydrogen? We have to come to grips with a hydrogen supply and distribution system that is convenient to the retail consumer as gasoline is. And we're a long way from getting there. Most communities in this country do not even have regulations that allow for the storage of hydrogen in a retail station. And so fire marshals and city councils and county councils all have to come to grips with regulating the storage and distribution and sale of hydrogen before we can have a hydrogen fuel cell future. So we've talked now about 8 different forms of energy: conventional oil and gas, unconventional oil and gas, liquefied natural gas, coal gasification, biofuels, wind, solar, and hydrogen. Is that enough to have a comprehensive, cohesive, partisan paralysis-free future for energy? Not yet. There are 4 more areas in the 12-point plan, beginning with we must manage the CO2 man-made in this society. Shell is an advocate of cap and trade. Cap and trade meaning the national government, our federal government, should set a cap on CO2 emissions by industrial sector. Those industrial sectors should then pay a price through technology and innovation investments to bring down the levels of CO2 through a trading system where they can develop value-creating trades to pay for that investment. We believe that it has to be at a national level because 50 states doing their own thing would make it very difficult for companies that do interstate business to be successful, or for people to move from state to state and understand what the energy environment is all about. So a national solution, we've joined the United States Climate Action Partnership to advocate for that, which is a group of 35 institutions, 29 companies, and 6 NGOs, and it is to help shape the future of the Lieberman-Warner bill, or whatever such bill deals with cap and trade and CO2 emissions in this country. Next, we must have a means by which this nation moves forward on energy demand. Energy demand that continues unabated will force us into ever more expensive near and longer-term energy solutions. So managing the energy demand, in my opinion, is not asking Americans to change their lifestyle. It is instead incentivizing creative technology solutions to the means by which energy is used, how buildings are built, how vehicles are designed and constructed, the source of energy for those vehicles, how appliances and how all of the forms of use of energy are managed. Energy demand management is another part of this comprehensive effort. Thirdly, we must promote energy education across this nation. How many of you can remember throughout your life having had a course on energy? It doesn't happen. Almost across the nation, learning about energy is something we don't spend time on. Whether it's at the student level or at the citizen level, energy is a given. Energy is the flip of a switch. Energy is at the end of a hose at a gas pump. Energy is something that's just there. But we have to understand it in terms of where it comes from, what it does, what its implications are, what its social good uses are, what its social abuses are. Because all of those factors, ladies and gentlemen, lead to the paralysis of partisanship. When we have an uneducated, uninformed electorate, we come up with some of the most irrational energy solutions we can imagine, such as the whole synfuels effort of the 1978 to 1982 period, where we tromped off to Colorado and set up an unsustainable mining system to try to get at the oil shale with federal incentives, which as soon as the oil price dropped, we forgot. And we all went away from the oil shale back in '82 with that mining technology. Shell stayed with a different technology called in situ, but we haven't yet developed it commercially. So we must educate the public. And finally, for those energy solutions that I haven't mentioned, such as nuclear, such as geothermal, such as hydropower, we must respect those alternatives as well and create the enabling frameworks that allow for nuclear solutions or geothermal solutions, because without the addition of nuclear, without the addition of geothermal, the other energy solutions that Shell has to offer will not be enough to meet the demands of the future. Let me close on the following note. The future is hard to describe and explain, as always. But I would offer to you 2 perspectives on the future, which my company calls its 2 scenarios. We look 25 to 50 years out every 3 years, and we do an analysis talking to the smartest people in the world, around the world, from north and south and east and west. And we go to those smartest people in the world by person and by small groups, and we say, what about this and what about that? And we listen. We listen carefully. And in the last couple of years, we've been out and about, and we've talked to hundreds of smart people around the world about their view of the energy future and what do we do as a global society. And listening across the populations to people that know what they're talking about, to elected officials, to scientists, to writers, to journalists, to common everyday people, we've come up with 2 scenarios that we think help to explain and describe how we could go forward in the future. One scenario is called Scramble. Scramble is a scenario where every country, looking after its own self-interest, looks for the solutions that it can manage to meet the energy requirements of its own population. Whether at the expense of another country or not is irregardless, because within a sovereign nation, all that matters under scramble is that that population is taking care of itself. Scramble would be those who advocate total, complete energy independence in America, without regard to what the implications are for other parts of the world. Scramble would also include countries that only worry about their own water, their own air, their own land use, and don't worry about what happens in other countries. Scramble is a scenario in which, over the near term, countries satisfy their immediate needs immediately, without considering the consequences on future generations. Another scenario is called blueprint. Again, listening to these very smart people around the world. Blueprint represents a scenario where coalitions of countries work together to find common solutions for common problems, where coalitions of companies and associations work together to find common solutions to common problems, whether those common problems are air quality, water quality, energy supply, technology exchange. All of these common problems result in common solutions, where cooperation and communication and community support across the board are the way of life. Now, for the first time in Shell's history, as we look at our scenarios, we have never ever said one is better than another, until now. Having looked into the future, 25, 50 years out, it is Shell's view that only a blueprint scenario will work for the good of man as we look at the constraints on the world's energy resources and on the requirements for the energy supplies of tomorrow, and on the dependency on the technology exchange and the technology sharing that would be necessary to both meet energy demand, to both contribute to quality of life, and to manage the CO2 implications of more energy supporting a larger world population. And so I leave you with the thought that blueprint requires anything but the paralysis of partisanship, and that should be the way forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm sure there are lots of questions. I'm going to ask one question, then I'll turn to you for questions. The 12-point plan you just outlined, Shell's 12-point plan, which you suggested would be something that occurs over the next 10 to 20 years, would put your company out of business, wouldn't it? And if not, how do you sell that to your shareholders?
Well, I think it would reshape our company, but I don't think it would put it out of business. Everything that I mentioned in the 12-point plan, except for point 12, which is the nuclear, the geothermal, the hydropower, we're already in the business of doing all of the other 11. What it would do is it would reshape the portfolio, so perhaps instead of more conventional oil, we'd be doing more unconventional oil, or we'd be doing more wind or more solar or more hydrogen, because in essence, we're in an energy world. We're not just an oil and gas company. We're primarily oil and gas, and I don't want to hide that we're not. But over time, 20, 25 years, yeah, we would see our portfolio reshape. But I think we'd be very much in the business as well of a whole new industry called carbon management. And the thought of, some people worry about carbon management saying, oh, we can't afford it. Oh, it will put so many people out of work. Oh, it's draconian in its essence. Well, frankly, there are those of us who believe that carbon management is a whole new opportunity for new technology, new ways of treating energy, such as carbon capture and sequestration. Imagine a whole new division, a whole new portfolio within our own company that just manages carbon capture and sequestration. That could be thousands of jobs and billions of dollars of investment, and of course, a return for sequestering that carbon. So I think there's huge opportunity out there.
Let's go to questions. Yes, ma'am?
Oil is definitely running out And why would we destroy our land, our nature, go into Colorado, go into Kansas, and destroy our land, just so we can, be comfortable? Why don't we try to focus towards, working with the environment in a healthier way? You say hydrogen fuel cell cars, they need oil to be produced. So, and solar panels need oil to be produced. So, oil will still be needed no matter what, and we're going to run out of it no matter what. Why destroy our land? Going into Colorado isn't going to help.
Okay, got the question. I'll paraphrase it. You don't need to repeat it. That's all right. I'll just paraphrase it for everybody who can't hear it. The questioner was asserting that oil is going to run out, and why should we go into our land, she said, or any land now, revising it, and destroying our environment in order to obtain that oil. She added that some of the products being used to develop alternative forms of energy, such as solar panels, wind farms, and so on, are also created with the use of carbon energy technologies. Take a crack?
Sure. I think that there are a couple ways to approach it. One is, first of all, I think the industry has done a very poor job of explaining how we have improved the methods and the science and the technology of extraction. We have, for example, taken offshore technology where we produce oil from multiple wells from a single platform. And so the footprint by which we, on land now, drill for oil is much reduced. So in terms of the destruction that people may remember from 30, 40, 50 years ago, in terms of the land surface destruction, that's been drastically reduced by the technology that we use on offshore platforms. But it still affects land. What we then have to do are make trade-off decisions. There really is no alternative to oil for certain applications, such as aviation fuel. We don't have an alternative in mind yet. We could imagine someday gas to liquids being aviation fuel, but that would require massive, massive quantities of natural gas and hugely expensive capital investments to move away from aviation fuel coming from oil. I'm sympathetic to the view that we'd like to protect our own land, let's use imports from other nations, except that the cost of those imports is skyrocketing and is likely to continue to skyrocket, which then puts people who are low-income Americans at risk of not being able to have a lifestyle that they deserve because the cost of product has become too expensive. So by augmenting the supply with domestic production, done in environmentally approved, sensitive ways, I think is a realistic alternative for the next 20, 25 years as we learn how to adapt new technologies to new energy uses. What we have to educate Americans on, I believe, is that the solutions are short-term, medium-term, and long-term. We can't solve a long-term problem with a long-term solution in the immediate term without severe dislocation of people who live in our society who need affordable energy. And so we have to gradually make changes. But given that the existing reservoirs are in decline, if we don't open up new reservoirs, we just don't have enough. And then we go into economic recession leading to something worse, perhaps, because without energy, we can't sustain industry. We can't sustain lifestyle. So it's all about trade-off and finding the right balance as time moves on. And this is my point about partisanship. Partisanship gets us nowhere. And it stymies everything, and what the solution is just higher prices if we're going to survive this kind of partisanship.
Question from a non-student this time? Yes, sir?
Wouldn't it be useful, in fact, if oil prices were higher, that would curb demand?
Question is, wouldn't it be useful if oil prices were higher? Wouldn't that curb the demand for oil?
Probably, but we don't know when. For example, oil prices doubled in the last year. Demand is down 1%. If it doubled again, demand would probably drop another 1 or 2 points. That means that we just don't have to produce as much new oil as we otherwise would. But there seems to be an elasticity to the price of oil that continues to see demand stability even while the price has doubled in the last year. Furthermore, there are major economies in the world that have even more elasticity to price. So, for example, China, India, major growing economies, subsidize the price of energy to their companies and to their consumers, which is another reason the price of oil keeps going up, because the demand is increasing continuously in China and India for more energy. And because the national government is subsidizing it, they are not feeling the full cost of energy, and they are becoming more competitive with America because America is paying the full price of energy. And by paying the full price of energy, by relying entirely on the import marketplace, we hurt ourselves while our competitors are subsidized. So just saying higher prices reduces demand only is a way of imagining that it could be different, but we haven't seen it work that way. On December 8th, 1998, less than 10 years ago, the oil price was $8.50 a barrel. Less than 10 years ago. So this is more than a 14-fold increase in the price of oil from that day. That's an unsustainable price rise, but yet the demand has increased over that time as well. So I don't know that we don't know what the high price would be. That's my simple answer.
John, were you surprised at Shell to discover that elasticity? Did your best analysts expect if the price doubles, the price of gas at the pump doubles, we're going to see a reduction in use?
Well, in this country, there's really no alternative to the lifestyle. We don't, in Europe, where they have used the price of energy to try to constrain demand and also pay for many social activities. So today, if you bought a gallon of gasoline in the UK, you'll pay something over $8. But for that $8, you have national health care, you have a national transportation system, you have subsidized housing for the low income, you have free education all the way through college for the citizens of the UK. There are different ways different countries manage the issue. The last time the United States of America raised the federal gas tax was 1993. Bill Clinton wanted to raise it 6 cents a gallon. The Congress refused to go along with 6 cents a gallon, but agreed to 3 cents a gallon. Because the American people were so angry and upset at the rising of the federal gas tax, the Congress went from Democratic to Republican in the '94 elections. So that's the kind of reaction you get in this country to gas taxes. So raising the gas tax is not a solution, in my opinion, to demand management. There has to be another way of doing it.
Okay, question from a student? Yes. Yes, please. Sorry.
Can you further explain the gasification process that contains the CO2 separately from the gas that you created, that you say will be put into the ground forever? How do you expect it to stay there and not be viruses?
Okay, can you further explain the gasification process that you said would allow you to separate the carbon dioxide from the fuel and allow you to sequester the carbon dioxide? And the questioner asks, and how are you going to guarantee that carbon dioxide is going to stay where you put it and not hurt the environment?
Well, remember, as I explained this, ladies and gentlemen, I'm a political scientist, not a natural scientist. So my technical explanation may be a little bit on the edge. But here's how we see it. We've known for decades that we can turn coal into natural gas or into liquid form through Fischer-Tropsch technology. The idea of gasifying coal rather than burning coal is an automatic efficiency improvement in the use of coal. You can use more coal molecules to create more energy by gasifying it than you can by burning it, simply because of the physics of the destruction of the molecules. As the CO2 comes off the coal, by virtue of the mechanical construction and the design of the filters and so forth within the gasifier, we can separate the gas from the CO2. CO2, when it is put under pressure, can be turned into a supercritical liquid. That's not quite a liquid, but it's not a gas. It looks like a liquid, but it's officially not a liquid. But it's solid enough that you can move it and you can store it. By taking it through pipelines, in liquid form, supercritical liquid form, to a geology that we believe is safe to permanently sequester, we then drill holes down through the earth, pipe the supercritical liquid down into the geophysical area under the earth, and we can pump so many tons of CO2 into that geology which can absorb it in ways that it will not be moving around or back to the surface, we believe that that is, while it's still being researched, we believe there's enough evidence to say this is a sound policy that we should move it forward. Now, there's a cost involved in both capturing the CO2, building the infrastructure, and then storing it underground. Can we guarantee, can we certify to the limit of infinity that that supercritical liquid is safely sequestered underground? That is a challenge. And so we need to have government involved in setting the framework under which the liability would be manageable. Because if the liability is totally to the company, what if 100 years from now or 1,000 years from now there's a massive release? What do we do about it? We have to protect against that. But we have enough confidence that there are geologies in the earth that will absorb that supercritical liquid and store it permanently that we think we should pursue the technology.
Question from a non-student? Yes, sir.
How much influence do speculators have on the price of oil?
How much influence do speculators have on the price of oil?
That is a really hard question to answer because nobody knows. I've been asked that question in Congress under oath. And my answer under oath is the answer I will give to you, which is we don't know. We estimate it could be in the range of 5 to 10% impact. We don't think it's larger than that because what goes up may come down. Speculators have their own way of governing themselves in terms of how much risk they will take. We think there's actually more built into the price in terms of geopolitical uncertainty than there is speculation. But let's be clear, in any commodity that's traded, whether it's coffee beans, pork bellies, or orange juice futures, there is a speculation involved where people will try to make money speculatively. But we've never seen any evidence that it's any more than marginal value in terms of the speculation in the range of 5 to 10%. The oil price we would be paying today instead of $120 would be closer to $65. But the deterioration of the of the dollar value is in large measure directly connected to the fact that we continue to ship dollars to the Middle East to pay for oil. In the last 4 years, we've shipped $2 trillion, US dollars, to the Middle East just to buy oil. Those $2 trillion have been used to help build up Dubai, help build up Doha, help build up the Abu Dhabi construction projects, and to produce more oil to ship to the United States, and to help bail out our banks. The reality is that's $2 trillion we did not invest in America by producing our own natural resources, by investing in our own technology.
Just to be clear, that list of things that money went to did not include the war or did include the war?
It has nothing to do with the war.
Okay, all right. Are you a student? Go ahead.
I wanted to ask you about Shell's future plans. You brought up the scramble scenario, sort of related to that. Talk about the end of easy oil. Can you hear me?
Yes.
The end of easy oil, and some public policies are open domestic reserves, right, to get at these reserves. But even with rising demand, you're going to need more oil. So you're going to have this problem in the future. So what does Shell do in the scramble scenario? In the past, given that Shell has been responsible for horrible human rights violations, particularly in the Niger Delta, is Shell willing to continue to use violence and intimidation in a scramble scenario?
Okay, that sounds like two questions to me. Allow me to paraphrase the question. Number one, you were asserting that Shell is going to need to continue to find oil even after the easy oil is done, and I think you addressed that in your talk, but you can comment on it again if you wish. And then you raised the question of Shell's practices in Nigeria, and you used the word, will Shell continue to exercise the use of violence against people in places like Nigeria?
I think if scramble is what actually plays out, Shell will continue to develop natural resources where we can and where we can operate in ways that we can live within our business principles. For example, our business principles respect human rights, so we do not do business in Myanmar. We do not do business in certain other countries that I won't name. We don't do business that requires us to pay bribes or that requires certain facilitation payments in order to get certain contracts. With respect to Nigeria, we've been in Nigeria for 40 years. During that 40-year period, we've built a workforce that now is somewhere around 30,000 jobs in Nigeria due to Shell's investments there. There are criminal gangs in Nigeria that are despoiling the Niger Delta in horrific ways.
You've asked your question.
There are criminal forces in Nigeria that are stealing up to 150,000 barrels of crude oil a day, who are then buying arms, who are then equipping themselves with fast gunboats and weapons that are more powerful than the Nigerian army. Shell does not work under conditions in which our staff or our contractors are at risk. We have shut in hundreds of thousands of barrels a day of production so as not to put our employees or contractors at risk until such time as the Nigerian government can ensure the security of our operations. There are horrible allegations about the pollution that Shell has caused in the swamps. Well, these criminals are knowledgeable enough to tap into our crude oil flow lines, but they are so inconsiderate as to, after they've stolen the oil and filled their barges with it, they simply do not close the valve on the flow line which they have installed. And so we are saturating swampland with crude oil that has been tapped by criminals having nothing to do with Shell. Is Shell perfect in Nigeria? Have there been instances where we've been harsh or been difficult to deal with? I submit that there probably have been cases. When it comes to the murder of Ken Saro-Wiwa, did Shell try and stop that from occurring? Well, Shell can't control the judicial system or the executive branch of Nigeria, but the Shell chairman can certainly, and did, ask the president of Nigeria to not proceed with executing the sentence that had been declared on Ken Saro-Wiwa. But the chairman of Shell has no authority over the president of Nigeria and what he would decide, despite the chairman of Shell's best efforts. So the question that Shell has to answer, and we've been answering for 40 years, can we operate under the auspices and with the invitation of the Nigerian government to do what we do, which is to produce energy? Or is there a point at which we would walk away because the conditions under which we're forced to operate are so inconducive to human rights, so inconducive to environmental degradation, that we no longer want our good name associated with Nigeria? Thus far, the government of Nigeria and every change in government has asked us to please invest more money in Nigeria, not less.
John, let me follow up on that question with regard to Nigeria, though. One of the other allegations that is frequently made is not directly tied to Shell, but you can address it. People say in Nigeria that companies like Shell and Exxon, which also operates there, and others, exploit the natural resources of a poor country like that, and then people outside the oil-producing areas, or even in the oil-producing areas, don't even have electricity, don't have the benefits of those natural resources. Those benefits are all coming to us. Have you thought about that kind of issue, and how do you respond to that?
We do a lot more than think about it. We act on it. In other words, Shell has actively implored the federal government to follow its constitutional obligations in dispersing the oil revenues generated by production according to the Constitution to the states and to the communities of the Niger River Delta.
The Constitution of Nigeria.
The Constitution of Nigeria demands the distribution of a certain percentage of those oil revenues locally. Throughout the whole history of oil production, that has been erratic. There are times when that has been distributed, there are times when it has not. Shell has a budget in the tens of millions of dollars to try to offset some of the local issues of poverty and education and sanitation by investing in communities for schools, for hospitals, or medical centers, for water systems, for sewage systems. And this is a governmental responsibility, but nonetheless we take some actions to try to help in that regard. This is a very serious situation in a country that is still struggling with rule of law, with the use of how money is managed. And really we come back to the core question, are we better to be there or better not to be there? And it's Shell's view thus far that we're better to be there, not only because it's a benefit to Shell shareholders, but it's a benefit to the country of Nigeria and to the 30,000 people who have jobs because we're there.
Okay, question from a non-student? Let me go to the upper level there. Non-student? Yep, go ahead.
A question and a comment. I'd like to corroborate what Mr. Hofmeister just said about the situation in Nigeria. Simply because I had the opportunity to work with a number of engineers from the National Petroleum Company of Nigeria some years ago in training and project management. And they will tell you stories that curl your hair about what goes on.
You know, sir, I'm sorry, but nobody's going to be able to hear your comment, and I won't be able to paraphrase it. So why don't you focus on a question, and we'll deal with that.
Mr. Hofmeister was right about Nigeria.
We heard you say that. Okay.
The question is that in the development of alcohol as a substitute for gasoline in the United States, for a long, long time we've known the net energy balance from alcohol is negative. I consider this to be, and I'd like to respond to this, I guess, on this basis, I consider this to be yet another example of how the government should not intervene in energy policy decisions when they really don't know the chemistry of the situation. And I think it's been a mistake to make an already inefficient fuel consumption system even less efficient by using essentially a poorer fuel.
Okay. Question is, the U.S. government has sanctioned the substitution of alcohol for gasoline. The questioner asserts that that's an inefficient transformation. Has the U.S. government made a mistake in doing so, and have oil companies like yours made a mistake by following that policy?
Well, we don't make a mistake when we follow the policy of the nation. I mean, that's what we have to do because that's the law of the land. But more seriously, the Department of Energy is well knowledgeable of the energy efficiency of ethanol from various sources. And the Department of Energy has done its job, in my opinion, in informing the Congress of the inefficiency of corn alcohol. Nonetheless, the Congress, in its political wisdom, has made a choice. Despite the best advice from oil companies, the best advice from its own Department of Energy, and it has caused a huge investment for whatever political reasons it sees as investing in a corn alcohol system. Shell has not invested in a corn alcohol system. We have instead taken note of the Department of Energy's research, where we see much more energy efficient means of producing biodiesel or ethanol from other sources, and that's where we're investing our money. So I think I have great confidence in the Department of Energy and its wisdom. I have much less confidence in the politics of the sausage factory that's being driven by partisan paralysis.
Okay, question from a student? Yes. Yes.
You said that Shell doesn't invest in Myanmar, but they did, the Royal Dutch Shell did in 1989, after the publicized death of thousands of Myanmar citizens. So I'm just curious, at what point and why did the Royal Dutch Shell leave Myanmar?
Okay, questioners reminds the President that he said that Shell does not invest in Myanmar, formerly known as Burma, but she said in 1989 Royal Dutch Shell had investments there. At what point did Shell decide to leave Myanmar and why?
I will confess ignorance to Shell history before 1997 because I had nothing to do with it. But I can tell you that from the time in which I've been associated with Shell, we have declared publicly in our Shell report every year that we will not operate under conditions in which human rights are violated in the following so many ways. And at the time I joined Shell, Shell had nothing to do in Myanmar. I don't know the actual year in which we withdrew. But we are not there. We have not been there in the time that I've been at Shell, and I really can't speak to the period of 1989. I'm sorry.
Okay. Question from a non-student? Yes, sir. Why did Shell pull out of the Greater London offshore wind farm project?
That was a decision made just about a week ago and announced in the global press. It was basically, as are many investments, an analysis of the economics. And as the economics were reviewed in this offshore project, we looked at the comparison of onshore projects in North America, and we just thought there was more value to be created by investing our resources in a North American onshore set of efforts than investing in the offshore. It was an economic decision.
Okay, question from a student? Yes, sir?
In regards to the education program, do you propose to pay for that initiative? And if it's funded by both companies, do you think there's going to be any public skepticism in regards to that?
Okay, in regard to your proposal for a public education program on energy security issues, who's going to pay for that? And if it's funded by the oil industry, won't the public be skeptical of it?
Oh, would you be skeptical of what we would offer you? Actually, rather than just talk about it, we did something about it. And I'm glad you asked the question. If you keyword into Google, energizeyourfuture.shell.com, up will come a website in which Scholastic, not Shell, Shell paid for it, but gave all the editorial license to Scholastic, which is a well-known third-party academic institution, well known for its education of young people. So we hired Scholastic to put a curriculum together targeted towards middle school and high school students, totally paid for by Shell, but no control over editorial content. And it doesn't sell any Shell products, and it talks about many technologies that Shell has nothing to do with, such as nuclear and others. And so Energize Your Future is a website which has been accessed by tens of thousands of teachers and students to pull down basically a curriculum of energy education. And I believe other energy companies have done something similar, BP, Exxon. So I don't think there's any hesitation in providing the raw material to teach the American public. It's a matter of how do we get the word out and how do school systems pick it up and adopt it into their school system curricula. In terms of educating the public, Shell's been even more active. If you go to a website called it's usenergysecurity.com. usenergysecurity.com is a website that is, again, free to access, which tells the story of Shell's 50 city visits. And usenergysecurity.com will give you about a 15-page write-up that gives you a summary of my conversations with 15,000 Americans from coast to coast on the myths and the realities, as well as the 12-point plan that tries to describe the energy education needs that we see. So I don't think education is expensive in this regard, other than that it takes time to teach people, and that time is money.
Does the Scholastic site contain any recommendations or analysis of proposals that are not part of the Shell program?
It is not a policy-oriented. It is a substantive, content-rich. Where does energy come from? How is it used? What are the alternatives? It doesn't recommend any public policy.
Okay. Question from a non-student? I'm sorry, that was a non-student, right? I'm sorry. Question from a student. Where are we? Where are we? Student? Student. Okay, yes, sir, right here in the middle. I'm sorry, please, I got to be.
The first point in the 12-point plan was basically to get more oil from here,
Right.
from places you can go and get oil. Wouldn't that drive the price down, and then that would hurt all the other technologies?
Questioner points out that the first point in the 12-point plan is to get more oil from places you can get it. Wouldn't that drive down the price of oil?
Yes, which is the whole point.
But that will hurt other technologies, developing other technologies. That's what happened before.
It'll hurt other technologies.
I actually don't believe it will anymore. I think we've moved beyond the point where we are so concentrated on oil and gas that all we care about is oil and gas. In 1997, Shell made the commitment to an alternative renewable portfolio as part of Shell's future. BP did something similar. Conoco and Chevron are actively involved in alternative energies as well, because I think we all see the future the same way, and that is the availability and the cost of more hydrocarbons gets ever more expensive. Let's move on to alternatives. I think we're beyond the day when we have to worry about $8.50 a barrel oil. I just don't see that happening in tomorrow's world anytime. And frankly, if the oil price dropped to $60 a barrel, I'd be cheering. I would be cheering the drop of the oil price to $60 a barrel because, ladies and gentlemen, we can't sustain the inflation that's coming at us from $100 to $120 a barrel. The labor costs, the material costs, the steel costs, the access costs is making projects totally inefficient and ineffective and unsustainable over the longer term. So this oil price is a hyper price that is way beyond reality. But I don't know what reality is anymore because the demand doesn't seem to go down even at this oil price. So we would advocate a lower oil price, and I'm sure our competitors would too, and we would continue to invest in alternatives because we think that's the right way to go in the future.
John, you keep talking about the investment in alternative fuels, alternative sources of energy. How big is that commitment, and how does that commitment compare to your investment in carbon-heavy sources of energy?
Over the last 5 years, Shell's invested $1 billion in alternatives for which we've had no return. So $1 billion over 5 years, roughly $200 million a year, for which there's no return. We have shareholders who compare our value to own our shares versus others who aren't investing in alternatives. So we have to strike a balance into how much we invest in alternatives which don't have a financial return. But in addition, we have to be prudent about how much we invest in unproven technology. Anyone who's ever worked in a research lab knows that a lot of money has ended up wasted because the research doesn't work. The outcome is simply much less than the hypothesis. And so you discard many research initiatives because they didn't work. That's money down the drain. So we have to be prudent. We work with our chief scientists, our technologists to figure out what technology is valuable to invest in, knowing that not all the technologies we invest in will ever be commercial. So people will criticize us, and I accept that criticism for not putting more money into alternatives, but we have to make prudent trade-off decisions on the fact that we do need more oil and gas in the future, and that's very expensive to invest in, and we need alternatives. So we try to strike a balance.
How did you pick the number? If you doubled it, would it make any difference?
I think based upon what we've learned thus far in 10 years of alternative energy research, we could not go faster than we're going because the technology is not maturing very fast. Let's take enzyme research.
What about nanotechnology, which we're doing?
Well, nanotechnology for solar. Nanotechnology for solar is very exciting. I'll give you an example. Sorry, I haven't visited your technology center at University of Delaware, but
we'll be glad to give you a tour.
In visiting at Cornell, I'm sitting with two nanotechnologists who are working on a house paint. The house paint is laced with certain nanobiomolecular materials, which when painted on the house and connected via wire, actually takes heat from the sun, from the ceiling, from the walls of the house, the exterior walls of the house, and heats the house. What a brilliant scheme to heat one's house in Cornell or in Ithaca, New York, just with the paint on the outside of the house. Now, that's not commercial. You couldn't afford the paint because of it's not commercially made yet. But what an exciting form of technology that is. But then I go to another university where they're investing in something called thin film technology, which is not paint on your house, but actually sets up photovoltaic rows of collectors, solar collectors, which creates electricity. And then there are the condensers, the solar condensers of solar power. So there are all kinds of technologies that are being worked, none of which are yet commercial, but many of which deserve more time and attention and more research. In terms of timing, I don't know how long it will take, because it's not just inventing the science and proving that it works, it's also scaling up, where it's continuously affordable, where you don't just afford the initial installation, but you can also afford the maintenance under all weather conditions. And so there are a lot of unknowns out there that have to be worked through.
Okay, now we're up to a non-student, I think. Would you please sit down? Would you please sit down? You had your moment in the sun.
Why do you think it's a good idea to
Should I call security?
chemicals that do not
Can I ask for security assistance here, please?
think you are justified in not diverting all
Would you
of
please sit down so everyone else...
recovering the biosphere from all the chemicals that
I'm
you
sorry,
dumped
would you mind?
into it? Please translate for my friend here and allow him to answer my question.
Okay. Do we have a question? Another question? Okay. Got that out of our system? Yes, sir.
Should we put more emphasis on energy efficiency instead of oil exploration?
Okay.
How much energy, how much oil would we save by having a higher efficiency, energy efficiency?
The question is, should we put more energy into more focus on energy efficiency rather than oil exploration?
Yes, we should. Absolutely. But we are constrained by the limits of today's infrastructure and today's knowledge. So, for example, the affordability of the internal combustion engine as the primary engine of choice for mass vehicle production is by nature 20% efficient. Changing that technology is something that Europe just accomplished, and I give credit to Europe. Europe, on a coordinated blueprint-type basis, decided to promote diesel engine technology for the purposes of increasing efficiency in Europe. They've done a good job of cooperating between auto companies, oil companies, environmental groups, and consumer groups, as well as government, to work together to create the platform by which today 50% of all cars sold in Europe are diesel engine cars, which average 42 miles per gallon, with the use of diesel fuel and efficient diesel and turbocharged diesel engines. We could do that in this country if we chose to. But under the paralysis of partisanship, which we've been following for decades, we haven't been able to do something like that. But Shell would be a strong advocate of such a move because more efficiency means longer life to the fuels that we know and more affordability to the people that need such energy.
Okay, last question from a student. Yes, sir.
Why does it matter that you guys always rely on the government to set standards for your companies to follow? Why, if you want to make more efficient engines, why doesn't Shell work with other motor companies that build these engines to work on efficiency instead of waiting for the government to set standards for which the companies to follow?
Okay, questioner is asking, why do companies like Shell wait for government standards to be set for engine efficiency in motor vehicles? Why not work with companies directly to develop that technology without waiting for government standards?
Well, we do work all the time independent of government with companies to find new solutions. So we're doing research today with General Motors on a variety of new standards, different approaches that the government has nothing to do with. But when it comes time to implement such innovation, what companies like Shell look for is level playing field. So imagine if the new standard, let's say it's more fuel efficient, it's environmentally more sound, more safe. Let's say it costs 12% more. Well, if we don't have a standard that government approves, then we're out there trying to sell a product that's 12% more costly in a marketplace that's price sensitive. So we may sell nothing. In other words, the consumers may not buy it because it's more expensive, even though it's cleaner and more efficient. So by setting a standard, then you have a means by which all companies have to meet that standard, and therefore we can lift the game of everybody. So it's really level playing field when it comes to standards. That's why we do standards.
John, we have a question from one of our viewers on Second Life. You mentioned in your formal remarks, and then I think you again said it in the Q&A at one point, that we like our air conditioners, we like our lifestyle. That seemed to be a given, kind of a standard understanding that it's not something you're prepared to challenge. The questioner on Second Life is asking, couldn't or shouldn't oil companies help to reset that standard and perhaps ask Americans and others around the world to change their lifestyle?
Well, we would support lifestyle changes if it...
Okay, let's just hear the answer to the question.
We would support lifestyle changes if it is technically and commercially doable and possible. But it's really government's role to tell us what to do in that regard. In other words, we're a simple company. We're a large company, but we're a simple company that operates to meet the shareholder needs of our investors and to do social good for society. But we are not in a policy-making business. We can recommend policy, we can suggest policy, but we're not in a policy-setting business. And to ask our customer, if you're a customer and you come to a Shell station and all the lights are out to save electricity at night, are you going to stop at a Shell station with no lights if the Chevron station across the street is all lit up? I think from a safety and a security standpoint, we would not be setting a good example because we could be aiding and abetting robbers.
Let's take a more realistic example, though. Suppose you had signs at the Shell station that said, drive less, take mass transit, or you provided subsidies for every gallon of gas you sold for someone using mass transit, rather than choosing an example involving public safety?
Well, we do at every Shell station have a list of ways to save and make your vehicle more efficient. By how to drive, how to inflate your tires, how to get tune-ups and oil changes and so forth. So we do encourage the efficient use of a vehicle at every one of our Shell stations. When it comes to the choices of whether people set their thermostat at a certain temperature or drive at a certain speed, I just don't think that is the role of a company to tell people how to live their lives in a free society. While we can encourage it, and we do in our message to our customers, we recommend driving at 55, which frankly is what your car was designed for. Your car was designed to get maximum efficiency at 55 miles an hour. We recommend and encourage people to do that. But when they're out on the road and they're doing 75 or 80, I'm not sure we can do anything about that.
Before we thank John Hofmeister tonight, just a couple of reminders. Our last Global Agenda program will be next week, not 2 weeks from tonight, 1 week from tonight, Wednesday night, May 14th. Our guest will be retired Air Force General Richard Engel, a national security analyst for the Central Intelligence Agency. He's already told me he'll have some really interesting things to say about why the politics of climate change is affecting the national security of the United States. That'll be the final Global Agenda program for this season. But if you want to be sure to get email announcements about future programs like this, be sure to print your email address on one of those bright orange sheets out in the lobby on your way out tonight. And now let's thank John Hofmeister, President of Shell Oil, for coming to the University of Delaware. Thank you very much.